Hello, everybody, and welcome to Sail Faster. Glad you tuned in. We have published around 45 episodes so far, with more on the way. And amazingly, we are in the top 5% of all Apple podcasts based on monthly downloads. So thanks entirely to you as listeners, and thanks to our fantastic guests as well, of course. Clearly, there's interest in and demand for these kinds of conversations in our racing community. So I'm really very humbled to be able to deliver some of them. I don't know about you, but I've learned so much over the last year about what makes top sailors tick, what makes them succeed, what makes them push against the odds, what makes them sail faster. And in fact, some of you suggested I need to consolidate all the insights into episodes dedicated to starting and prepping and so on. And I'll probably do that sometime in the future, perhaps at the end of this season. Speaking of suggestions, as you know, I always welcome feedback and ideas about future episodes and guests and so on. And in fact, today's episode comes from a suggestion by the ever gracious Sarah Colarusso. So thank you for that, Sarah. Please keep them coming. I'm easy to find. I'm Pete at sailfaster.com. Pete at sailfaster.com. Anyway, today's guest is one of the most quietly influential sailors, I think, on the J70 circuit, and that's Patrick Wilson. Whether it's Midwinters, the North Americans, or the Bacardi series, if you've been following top-tier J70 racing over the last few years, chances are you've seen Patrick's name near the top of the result sheet, often as part of some of the most respected and well-run programs in the fleet. So Patrick has a reputation not just for his trimming skills and consistency under pressure, but for the calm, collaborative way he helps elevate everyone around him. He's sailed with teams like Catapult, Black Mamba, and Stampede. He's worked with legends like Victor Diaz de Leon, Jud Smith, Bruno Pasquinelli. And today, in part one of our chat, we're going to dig into all that experience, how he prepares, what he looks for in the race course, why great communication might just be the most underrated skill in the sport. So great stuff to come from Patrick. I think you'll really enjoy it. In part two, which I'll publish in a little bit, we're going to dive into his premium race boat preparation business based in Charleston. So lots to talk about there. I really loved my chat with Patrick. He's a great guy, and I do hope you'll feel the same. And here we go with part one. Patrick, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
How's the weather in Charleston, first of all?
The weather, spring is here. The pollen's finally starting to clear out. I have a little bit of allergies left, as you may be able to tell. We just had Charleston Race Week last week, a great event, kind of like the major big event here for the season.
For sure.
And now we're into summer. It's 80 degrees every day and beautiful sea breeze.
How was the race week for you?
So Charleston Race Week's always one of my favorite events, right? One of the only events I'm home, get to stay in my bed. But it's a lot, you try to go out of your way to help everyone. We've got the boat shop here, Next Level Boat Works and everything, and the sailing. And so I love it, but I always breathe a little bit of a sigh of relief when it's over. This year we had great fleet, a lot of boats. As far as Charleston goes, we had 1 day of a westerly and 2 days of a dying northerly, which if you sailed it very often are probably the trickiest, shiftiest conditions you can have in Charleston.
On top of the tides and current.
Yeah, the current's always there. So a lot of shifty wind on top. So it was fun. It was dynamic racing. You're never out of it. No lead was safe. So it was fun.
Were you sailing J70s?
Yeah, so I was sailing J70s with Stampede with Bruno Pasquinelli, the owner, who, it's funny, it's come like full circle. When the J70 first came out, I sailed with Bruno for a long time and was the youngest guy on the boat. And now I'm back 9 years later and I'm the oldest guy besides Bruno. We have a great team with myself, River Paquin, and Griner Hobbs.
And you're the veteran on the team.
I guess so.
I love the J70. I think it's a really interesting boat, right? It's extremely competitive class, large class, and everything I've read about it is that it's a relatively easy boat to sail. I mean, obviously, there's a huge difference between sailing a boat well and winning races. A huge gap there. And also, I noticed that it had you have a number of different classes, right? Where you have one pro, multiple pros, Corinthian. How does that all work?
I think the class has done a really good job. I mean, from the get-go, the class kind of exploded. We have all these boats. It's very competitive, but I think there's room in sailing for a little bit of everything. And I think the class has done a very good job of having, a mixed plus division with a half female, half male, a one pro division, a Corinthian division, an open division. They all get to compete together, but then there's still subclasses within those. So, you might be fighting to win the open division, but when you watch the guys competing to win the Corinthian division, it's the same level of competition, same intensity, just. So,
Do you sail in separate fleets between Corinthian and Open, or is it
no, it's normally all one division. They will pull aside a handful of regattas a year. Like they'll have a Corinthian Worlds and one pro. So that there are some standalones, but for the most part, it's all together.
And you're in the Open, presumably.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's go back to your origin story, as I always say. How did you get into sailing and racing?
So I grew up in Charleston, more specifically on James Island. Both my granddad and my dad sailed. I would say more locally, not traveling a lot or anything like that. But when I was a kid, when I was about 6, my granddad built me an Opti in his garage behind his house, and they lived about a quarter mile from James Island Yacht Club. And I think he built it when I was 5, and at 6, I was allowed to take sailing lessons with it. And I just got really into it, and I had a really good group of friends. And from about the age, let's say 8 to 10 or 12, it was like you could sit home with the babysitter all day during the summer, or you could ride your bike to the yacht club and sail with your friends with no adult supervision.
Sounds like a great way to spend your summer.
Yeah, and so it wasn't as much racing back then. It was more like we would just get in our boats and sail to like the Barrier Islands and play manhunt, it was just a lot of fun. So I think sailing definitely started off as a lot of fun.
It sounds like an idyllic child.
Yeah.
How did you get connected with J70s?
Well, I think for me, it was a little bit of right place, right time, right? Like I sailed all as a junior in high school and in college. And then after college, one day someone asked me if they could pay me to sail. And I was like, wow, that's a thing. And I went and did it and went well. And I sailed, started sailing some keel boats, J24s, this, that, and the other. And I think 2013 is when the J70 came out. And I kind of thought, wow, I think this boat's going to take off. And I think this could be like I'm the right age to really start to learn. My favorite thing in sailing has always been one design, big fleets. And so as the J70 grew, I kind of played right to my wheelhouse and what I love to do.
Did you find a role on it that you liked, or do you?
I started off with Bruno and the Stampede. I would call tactics some, but I don't know. I was always kind of driven to trimming and speed and kites and waves and surfing, and that kind of stuff was really, I think, what I love the best.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the early days were a lot of fun too. A big draw in the beginning is this new boat came out, and there were so many of them, and no one knew exactly how to sail it. Which that was my favorite part, of trying to learn and figure out what you could figure out before the next guy.
Yeah, I was looking at the J70 before this call just to sort of get a refresh on it. There's a ton of webinars and YouTube and information including yours on the J70, how to sail it, how to sail it fast, how to rig it, how to trim it, that sort of stuff. Really, really interesting. So it's good. It seems to have, like many of the J boats, a very large class of owners who always are happy to share, tips and insights and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing. I think especially as pros, I mean, I can't speak for all the pros, but I can speak for myself. As in, I think it's part of our responsibility to help and answer questions and be around and help people when they need it. Because at the end of the day, the better people are at sailing, the stronger our fleet's going to be.
I'm thinking that the J70 is my next boat, by the way.
I mean, you guys have an amazing class in Annapolis, though, with the 105.
Oh yeah, it's really healthy. It's really healthy. Same thing, a bunch of people who are really very competitive but prepared to share things. So it's good.
I lived in Annapolis for a short period of time. After college, when I first started getting into pro sailing, I came up there and interviewed to be the main trimmer on a TP52 called a Nima Core for a guy named Inyo Stefini, and I worked at the Doyle Loft for Chuck O'Malley.
Oh yeah.
And I'll never forget. I showed up in Annapolis. And I'd never really sailed anything bigger than like a laser or maybe a J24, but I didn't really tell anybody. And I got there at like sunrise. And I saw this boat, these grinders and all this stuff. And I was like, this is the coolest boat I've ever seen. I can't believe I could sail on it. And I took 2 hours before anyone got down there and kind of figured out what to do to work the grinders and the buttons. And I just faked the whole thing. And they hired me as the main trimmer and boat captain. And I moved to Annapolis.
That's a great story. Yeah. One of those things where you think, well, how hard can it be?
Yeah. Halfway through the first day, they were like, well, you tend to carry the Traveler pretty high and a lot of twist in the main. Is that your style? And I was like, oh, yeah, that's definitely my
style. It's what's worked for me down in Charleston.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you say you jumped on early before anybody was there and started figuring out how to make it.
Worked it through my mind enough to get off the dock and go sailing.
That's brilliant. If only I could do that.
Yeah.
So Pat, can you talk to us about your pre-race or pre-regatta preparation? I know when we talked a couple of weeks ago now, you're a big advocate for mental preparation. Can you just sort of describe what that's like for you?
Yeah, I think so for me personally, I definitely deal with some anxiety. I guess you'd say a generalized anxiety. Well, most people have some type, but I tend to have a good bit. And the sport we've chosen, we are trying to predict an unseeable force of nature, and the uncertainty in that can definitely raise anxiety levels quite easily. So I think before regatta or just in general, I try to do some meditation in the morning, some breathing, try to keep the fever down, so to speak, when things hit the fan. But I think the biggest thing that I do well is when I go sailing. It's one of the only times in my life that I can purely be in the moment and be sailing and not worried about everything else and zone everything else out and just focus on my job. And I think that really helps. Just I leave my phone at the dock. You leave everything else behind, and if we're going down wind and waves and I'm trimming the kite, all I'm worried about is how we're catching the next wave and not really much else. I think it sounds simple, but it's hard to do sometimes to get yourself that focused into that small of a world for the moment.
No, that's really fascinating because I agree. It's 100% absorbing.
Yeah.
You have no space, even at the level I sail at. You have no space to worry about anything
Yeah.
else going on in life. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. I've always been a big believer in that and the team side of the sport. And, we have a great coach right now at the Stampede, Morgan Trubovich. And, I think every coach has something they're good at. Like, if you have Ed Adams, he's amazing with weather. If you have so-and-so, they're amazing with this. I think one thing that Truby brings to the table is his ability to look at and talk to you about team focus and communication and that stuff. That's one thing as a new team, we're really working on the Stampede, and it can be hard to get everybody on the same page. And I think the more we go into this, we're lucky we're pros, so everyone's pretty good. A lot of it comes down to the team and how you as a team sail with each other and react to each other. And it's easy to spool each other up, but it's hard. When you're on a good team, you can feel it, and you have an edge on people just because of how you operate as a group.
And what are the signs of that? Is it that things are done seamlessly? You know what people are thinking and doing?
I think yes. One thing that this is going to sound kind of weird, but one thing I'll kind of judge sometimes. I think when you go to dinner as a team, if you're sitting around dinner having a conversation that you're all into that has nothing to do about sailing, sometimes it hits me as I think this is probably a pretty good team because we don't need to talk about sailing. We have like some common interest, and we're getting along here. And so I know that's not sailing related, but I think it just shows we're here for more than sailing. We get along. We respect each other.
No, I think it's vital that if when you work with anybody, any sort of form of work or activity, to have that human connection with people just makes things a lot easier in terms of communication and trust and
For
that.
sure. I think and trust is such a hard thing, but it's the big thing in the sport, especially. I've been lucky that I've sailed with some very, very good tacticians, and I trusted those guys so much. I'd run into a burning building after them. Not that we would win every race, but I had so much faith in those guys that you have the ability to win any race.
Yeah, I talked to Kenny Reed recently, and he was talking about doing long distance offshore racing where your life is literally in other people's hands, and,
Yeah.
and their lives are in your hands. So you do create major bonds between you in those sorts of circumstances.
But talking about communication, Truby, I told you he's big on that. He jokes a lot about how, in the military, they have evolved their communication so much they speak in numbers. Like, and we are so primitive in our sailing communication. We use 30 words to describe what they'll say in like a code 5 or something, whatever they say. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I want to go back to anxiety.
Yeah.
I've been fortunate to talk to many of the top sailors, and they all quietly express sometimes quite deep anxiety, and that always amazes me.
Yeah.
Just given people's demeanor is very calm, they're very confident, they're top of their game. Presumably, sometimes anxiety drives you right to perform better, to make sure you covered all the bases, checked all the checklists and that sort of thing. Is it a positive as well as
It's definitely a double-edged sword. I mean, I think I have a very good eye for detail and notice things and tend to be very perfectionistic, which I think might be driven by my anxiety a little bit. So there's definitely some positives with it. It's learning how to, and I'm still not the best at it by any means, but keep it in check when there's things out of your control. How do you not let that affect your performance? I would say.
is there a particular race that your mental preparation made a big difference at that during
Well,
the race?
I would say maybe not as much as a lesson I learned. So when we won the Worlds in 2016, we did all this sailing all summer. We were in San Francisco we were sailing with Joel Ronning, the Catapult, myself, Chris Stockey, and John Kostecki, who that's one of the guys that really I learned so much about sailing from him. The guy's amazing and probably one of the best ever. But we were the most ready I think I've ever been for a regatta. And going into the last day, I think we had like a 15 or 20 point, pretty big lead on the last day. I mean, I've never won a Worlds before. That was the only one I've actually ever won. So I was quite anxious, as you can imagine. And, JK has won, I don't know, 15 or 20 Worlds at this point, And so I come down to the dock all ramped up, like, all right, what are we going to do today? How are we going to respond? He just looked at me real calm and said, we're going to go out there and we're going to treat it like it's any other day of sailing. I was like, what do you mean? We don't need a special. It's like, no, we're going to go out there and we're just going to go sailing and do everything we've done every day for the last 3 months. I thought that was pretty telling about how cool and calm his demeanor, where his mind was,
Yeah, because otherwise that raising the kite or coming around the offset mark for that last leg, it's sort of weighted by all that anticipation, right? So,
oh yeah, like I might have been trying to keep it cool on the outside in front of him, but I was a nervous wreck on the inside.
Do you practice visualization techniques? Do you start thinking through that?
A little bit, I would say. Before, after an event, maybe. I do believe in the fact that if you can't say it out loud or see yourself doing it, how are you ever going to do it in reality? Even if it's good or bad, I'm pretty simple. Like I like the little Headspace app, and like I go to the gym pretty early in the mornings, and usually I go to the gym and like 10 minutes before I go in the gym, I do my little 5-minute guided morning meditation. And it seems, just to take 5 minutes and kind of just chill out and, relax your brain seems to help a little bit.
I saw that quote about, it must be from you now, about if you can't say it, you can't do it.
Yeah.
What's that mean to you?
I just think if it's something about believing in yourself a little bit, if you can't in your mind see yourself doing something and believe that you can do that, whether you actually do it or not, but if you don't believe you have the ability or the chance to do it, I think it's harder to actually do in real life.
And and then saying it out loud is it's one thing to think about in your head, right? That hey, we're going to make a really good exit round the gate mark or that sort of thing. But to say it out loud, we're going to make a really good exit, a good rounding of a gate mark is different. That's really, really interesting.
And like you said, I don't think it has to be cocky or anything like that. It's more just believing in yourself that you can do it.
Yeah, for sure. So you've written a ton of articles in sailing media about boat and team preparation and sail trim and writing things down the deck and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But what for you are fundamentals to your preparation for a race?
Well, I think a lot of times I end up being the speed guy on the J70 specifically in the rig. I mean, obviously you're working as a team, but I've done a lot of that. So for me, I think getting on a boat, if you bought a J70 and we were going sailing tomorrow, primary things I would like to think about would be making sure the rig's in the center of the boat, which is, measuring it with a weight each side. I like to use the jib halyard because the jib halyard connects right about where the hounds do in the mast. So I think because you can control that quite easily, where if you go to the kite halyard or the main halyard, you can't really control the tip. But make sure the mast in the center, get to your rig tune on your tuning guide. Checking the pre-bin with a little pre-bin gauge, I think is always a really good idea to make sure, because that's, at the end of the day, we do a lot of stuff with Jud Smith, and he always says, like, at the end of the day, we design these sails for a certain pre-bin. So make sure that you're at your numbers, your pre-bin's right. And then, like you mentioned, marking the deck with, for me, really good jib sheet marks. The J70 has you do a lot of in-hauling in the J70, which isn't in all classes, but you do it, and it's quite critical to going upwind. So, I've got degrees of 9, 10, and 11 written on the deck on each side to kind of know how far in or out I am on the jib, and then really good sheet marks. I think for most people, though, like we have 9, 10, 11. If you were talking like big picture, right where the non-skid meets the glossy on the cabin top, if your jib's living about in that area, you're pretty good 90%.
That's a rule of thumb, is it, for the J70?
I'm very good at overcomplicating things, but you can also simplify them as well.
What do you think you do differently, or maybe even think differently about preparing the boat or preparing yourself for the race that perhaps is fundamental to your success?
I think that's a tough one. I don't think there's any like magic bullet in my mind with a lot of the sailing. I don't think I've ever been particularly more talented than anyone or better. I think I've always taken the approach of I'm going to outwork everybody. I'm kind of a proponent of the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours, where if I'm going to beat you, it's probably going to be because I put in a lot of time, a lot of effort, and made slow, gradual gains.
That's a really interesting and very humble answer from a world champion. But that notion of not feeling you're better than others because of pure talent, which is quite surprising, really. Top sports people talk about imposter syndrome.
There could be a little bit of that in there somewhere.
So many top athletes do.
Yeah.
Athletes with strings of medals and that sort of thing, they're exactly the same as you about you have to work harder. In my working life, when I first came to the States, I came to graduate school and went to work for Procter & Gamble, which is, this is corporate America bullshit, right?
Yeah.
But the Americans there just sounded so much smarter than me. They'd all been to Yale and Harvard and Princeton. God. So I decided that I was going to just work harder. And I worked weekends and studied and that sort of thing. Because I felt the same. Like, these people are much more talented than me. So.
I think coming through junior sailing, I was a good junior sailor, but I was never like unbelievable on a national level or anything. And I mean, that's probably kind of how I got started in the boatwork side of things. It was an avenue into sailing, like, that not many people wanted because the work was hard and stuff, but you could produce these amazing boats that might give you an edge over people if you really knew what you were doing.
In part two of this, I really want to get into boat preparation, which I know you're an expert at. One thing I wanted to ask you was a really interesting quote in one of the articles in probably Sailing World. Here's a quote. It's essential the driver is placing the boat at the proper angle out to the hoist for a quick exit out of the offset. Got it. That all sounds good to me. Having telltales on the shrouds will give you a great sense of where the bow should be. And I thought it was really interesting because this is my issue. I lose track of the race course geometry when you've come around the mark, and I'm sort of looking for where's the finish to try and figure out what's that angle I need to take out of, we have an offset mark.
Yeah.
How do you use those telltales to assess the right angle?
I think that article was from a while ago. I was thinking about this, and I would refine some of the stuff in there. Still using the telltales. I think a couple of things. First off, I think the offset leg is one of the most overlooked areas of the race course. We fight tooth and nail for 6 inches to a foot upwind to cross another boat, where you get the weather mark and everybody just kind of takes a break for 20 seconds on the offset leg, where I think if you continue to hike hard and really focus on trimming your sails, you can pick up a half a boat length to a boat length on the offset leg pretty quickly. And for the percentage of how short it is, it's a big difference versus upwind when we're, So I think that, and then I think that also leads into a better set because everybody's a little more switched on going to the set. Obviously, the faster you get the kite, the faster everything else. But I think a lot of it comes back to the teamwork thing. I think once you sail the boat enough and you have your telltales on your shrouds, you get a good sense of what angle they should be. But, the sets are always changing depending on, if you're in a big fleet, it's a lot of communication. Like I know Griner's very good about, our default set is going straight with a little down out of the set to hoist the kite. And as soon as I yell made and the kite goes up, we heat up the angle. But there's also a couple other plays where he'll say there's going to be a hot set, which means we're going to set high, or set likely to defend, meaning there's a big pack of boats behind us. And so at any time during the set, if he says my boat defend, we know exactly put the bow up. So I think, I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I think it gives people a little bit of an idea.
You're absolutely right. When you come around the windward mark, there's
a break.
It's sort of like a sense of relief. Okay, we made it.
Exactly.
And then you bear off, and the wind sort of goes quieter as well because you're starting to go down. The focus is then on getting the pole out, doing the pre-feed, and everybody's eyes are on getting that shoot up, right?
Exactly.
I don't know if we are focusing on is a main and jib trimmed for that essentially a close reach leg down. That's really interesting. I'm going to take that away from this. But the other thing is just about using those telltales. Is it just basically just gives you a reminder of where what the wind angles are between the windward leg and the offset?
I tend to be a little more of a feel guy, so I think it's more helpful for a driver than anything. Just kind of know where the angle is,
Yeah. And then when you're defending and you're heating it up, that's presumably to stop people driving over the top of you.
Exactly, yeah.
And taking you wind, yeah.
But if you round in a big pack, because the great thing about the J70 is we'll have a lot of 60 to 90 boat regattas. So if you round in 25th, there could be a huge pack on your stern, and that's when your risk assessment really comes into like, How much are we willing to defend? Do we need to go high early? What is the, what's the priority on the run? Is the priority on the run that we have to be on the right side of the run? Because if it is, then we're probably going to really be willing to defend and do whatever we can to not get rolled and stay in the high lane. Or is it okay to jibe? So, I think it's kind of like the gate and the offset shape your next leg in a big fleet dramatically. Just like the bottom gate. If you get a bad rounding trying to go to one side at the bottom, it's very hard to get your tactician to where he wants to be. And same thing with the offset at the top. So, knowing if you're happy to jibe early, you might not worry about defending. And if people try to go too high and roll, you'll jibe out.
There's if you have, as you say, 50 or 60 boats coming behind you, especially if you're in sort of middle or top third, that sort of thing, there's a ton of disturbed air behind you, right? And so that always, for me, even if we have to sort of go left or the right side of the course, is if you're coming up, I'm always worried about doing a jibe set or even jibing early and just getting into that messy air.
100%. I think some rules of thumb there in a big fleet are like, I know what I think about is, so if say you're in the top 20 of a 100 boat fleet, let's just say, I think you have to go at least a third of the run, maybe a little more before you even think about jibing, because it's just, unless you're going to jibe and be within 10 degrees of land the mark. I mean, if there's a massive shift and you're within 10 degrees, it's probably fine.
Then you got to do it.
There's a big penalty. So there better be a big gain on the other side.
Interesting. Can we talk about starting?
Starting has changed a lot in the last 5 years, like dramatically.
What's going on?
So let's say 5 or 6 years ago, if you had a really good line sight, you could start in the middle of the line, boat links in front of people. Like, I mean, sometimes it was like you were scared. But then we saw the Velocitech come out, and then pinging became a thing. And then so the midline sag started to disappear. And then recently now the race sense is here, and it's not going anywhere. It's a great program, a great product. And, part of me doesn't like that we've lost some of those skills, but I think it's the future and it's here. And it's pretty binary. If the box says red, you're over. And if the box says green, you're not over. So it's kind of, you got to live and die by that. Some of the big positives I think about it are, no more general recalls, no black flags. I mean, we would go to J70 Worlds and, out of 10 races, more than likely 8 would be started under U flag. It was stressful. And now with the Vacaros, I just did the Worlds in Palma in the fall. And, it's crazy that, yes, you're over, but you can round. And I think the Brutus guys actually won a race after being over early. Which, would never happen back then. So that's the
because they knew straight away.
Yeah, and and there's no black flags anymore, so you're allowed to turn around and clear yourself immediately. On the other side, I think, and we're still learning, but I think this whole box thing has really made starting a little more video game like than feel. By that I mean it seems to be all about the ratio. Like I know in a J70, now you got to dial it in for waves and wind, but generally you want to be around 60 to 70 meters at a minute. And if you're much inside that, it's going to be very hard to not be over and keep your speed. And if you're outside of that, you can, so it's all, the game now is ratio. Where do I want it? When I tack at 1 minute, I'll say two things. It's ratio and density. So I think the bigger the fleet, the more likely you are to be more concerned about density as far as like, I just need to find an area that's not super crowded on the line. Or like this weekend sailing the Melgus 15 with 7 boats, you're probably more likely to push the ends of the line because, in a 100 boat fleet, if you get a good start in the middle and go fast, you're in the top 20 already. So for us, it's finding low density on the line and then the ratio as your last minute to minute and a half approach of meters to seconds. It seems to be the key. And I think whoever gets that best usually has the best starts.
And for you on a J70, is it you talked about being a minute and 60 meters? Is it roughly 1-to-1, a meter a second?
That's good. I think that's a good place to start, but I also think somewhere within the last 30 seconds, you need to have roughly 10 meters more than seconds to be able to accelerate. I think one thing, this is again something that Truby and Larson, some guys that have coached me before, have talked about a bunch, is that we overlook the speed versus the number. So a lot of times we get very, very occupied on having that thing say 1 meter at the gun. And I'm as guilty as anybody about this, where I think as people get better, I think it would be better to be like 10% over target speed at 3 meters.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
that's where the ratio comes in. So yeah, I think you can get there at 60 and 60, but that's kind of like our cutoff. If we're inside that, then you get real nervous.
Yeah, it's interesting. On the Velocitec we have, I think after 2 minutes, it starts to give you that visual graphic in terms of are you early, are you late, that sort of
Yeah.
thing. I've started to try and think about that. But yeah, I know, I hear what you're saying, that you'd rather be slightly late, but at top speed or even over boat speed.
And I
Over
think one
target.
thing, I was lucky enough to sail with Victor Diaz de Leon a good bit in my career. And one thing he does a good job of every morning is religiously doing 2 or 3 practice starts with ourselves before the race starts. Even if we have to ping our own imaginary line, we just go from like a minute. So he's really just dialed into looking at the box, and because it just changes so much based on waves. And then, you also be careful if you get a big lefty, all of a sudden you're gonna get the line really slow, or if you get a big righty, you're gonna get the line really fast on the meters. So it's an easy thing to think about the ratio, but there's so many variables in it that, it's hard to compute fast, I guess.
I talked to Steve Hunt recently, and he sells TP52s and all sorts
Oh,
of
yeah.
things. And he talked about the importance of the practice starts, and I totally get that. It really, at my level, it really, it really helps me.
Yeah.
And he talked about doing the first couple on feel alone. Don't look at the instruments; just get it
That's
feel
good.
alone,
Yeah.
and then start to bring the instruments in.
Yeah.
Because, like you, he wanted to retain the feel of it,
Yeah, definitely.
and then add instruments onto that, which I thought was a really interesting approach.
Yeah. And one other thing, kind of a side note that we're starting to learn about the Vacaros starting to just remind me of is it seems like you have to be willing to bail out of your group of boats late in the start if you have to. Like sometimes if you're in a group of boats and you're like, this group's probably going to be over, there's a good chance they're going to be over and you just got to get out of there. There's no more covered. There's no more, So
The Vicaris thing is, it's quite I'm not sure the right word to use, maybe democratize the fleet. The idiots like me can now have
everyone knows the line is.
an accurate,
Yeah.
the same data that somebody like you could have. Obviously, I'm going to sail it a lot more incompetently than you, but I think that's a factor in maybe a little bit of resistance here and there to widespread use of the Vicaros.
Yeah. Another nice thing it does that I'm sure most people know is it gives you that line square to number as far as what wind shut the line square to, which I think is important. I mean, if I'm going to think about a start, it's kind of like 3 different things. Like how big's the fleet? How important is the side of the race course? Like obviously if you have, like we're in Charleston, if the current's doing a certain thing, I might have to start the boat whether I want to or not, because we got to get out of the current that way. But if that's not a factor, then the middle of the line becomes more open quickly. And then you start to look at the bias as well and see, because on a big line, it doesn't take many degrees for it to be a lot of boat lengths. So it's kind of like sailing is a giant game of risk management, right? That's all we're doing at the end of the day is like, how risky do I want to be on the start versus, oh, I'm really fast, I don't need to be that risky, or, that's all it is.
The line set angle, if the Vacaros displays that all
Yeah.
the time, that's super useful in terms of immediately knowing the bias, right? If you know the wind direction, you know which end's biased. Yeah.
We would always, as soon as our old practice was, as soon as we would ping, we'd aim straight down the line and look at the compass, which is pretty accurate. It's just like one less step, no more pinging, no more look. So, it's gotten easier, but now everybody has the information. So it's also gotten harder.
Yeah, I can't wait to not ping, because I'm never sure whether our pings are accurate. And
Exactly.
And then when you are approaching the line, you've got 6 meters and it's 4 seconds to go. You do think 2 foot could make a big difference, but anyway.
Yeah, like we try to shoot for. I mean, that's a great point, because I think we try to shoot for like 2 to 3 meters at full speed. Like I think 1 meter or even 2. I mean, it's almost too risky. Like you'd rather be 3 or 4 meters at full pace than 2 meters at half speed, or 1 meter in general. Like 1 meter that you're playing with fire.
Yeah.
What we've learned is that it rounds up and down. So you could be 0.6 meters and then it hits 0.5 and it goes to 0 immediately.
Do you have a preferred approach to the line? Or does it 100% depend, or starting strategy, or does it 100% depend on the conditions, exactly as you talked about? There's current, we need to stay away from that in the line.
I think that. So I would say normally that's more of a tactician kind of thing and what their style is, but I can kind of throw some scenarios out there to you that I've seen that have been successful. I think one thing in between races and even up to like 3 minutes. Most teams I sail on, it's a good idea to stay in the, granted, no current or anything aside, but stay in the middle of the line and stay upwind of everybody. I think getting too far to lure to the line below the pack, like at 5 minutes or 6 minutes before the gun, is just, there's nothing good can come from that. So if you're above the line, above the pack in the middle, the 5 minute gun goes off, you have the best view of the breeze, the clearest wind to do a wind shot, and kind of really look around and assess the race course one last time. And kind of, it's good to have that like 5 or 4 minute check in with the team as far as what are we thinking here? What are, so I think it's, even though, like what I try to do with tacticians, you never want to give biased information. I try to ask questions to help them or help just understand what they're thinking. Like every time 4 minutes, it's like, all right, what do you think? Where do you want to be here on the start? And then from there, it's kind of, a lot of times it depends on the guys. Like with JK, we always had a place on the line we were shooting to be on port at 2.5 minutes going back. He would say, all right, I want to be, pin third at 2:30. And every guy's got their own way, but the one thing I will say is all the best guys have a very good process for doing it. They do all the time. I'm not, repeatable process is the one common denominator, regardless of what their style is.
Yeah, I like the 2.5 minutes below the pin, a couple of boat lengths below the pin, coming in on port. That I wouldn't say that really works, but it's just having a repeatable process that I know where I am, and do that a few times to practice it. We had a J105 clinic the other day in Annapolis, and it was a good chance to try things that you're uncomfortable with. Yeah. And so for me, I have much more comfort coming in on that, doing a port tack base lag and then tacking onto the final approach. And I didn't really know what to do when you have to come from the other end. And we had a guy on a boat, Jamie Gilman, who sails on J105 Patriot. He was brilliant. And he was really helping me out. Do you know him?
That's Ray Wolf. I know Ray Wolf pretty well.
Yeah, exactly. On his it's on Ray's crew. Yeah, and they were great at sharing knowledge about how they do things on Patriot, which is probably the top boat in the fleet, sort of thing. But he was really helpful in terms of getting me to think differently about that boat end approach, coming in being a lot deeper than I thought I would be. So new for me was that notion of using vertical space, turning hard up and down, rather than burn sort of horizontal time along the line. Both to defend space, I started to get that. Okay, if I turn up really hard here, the boat's still going to have some motion. We'll create some room to leeward of us, hopefully. But also just to avoid eating up that distance along the line.
Another thing we really try to focus on there is what's our minimum creep speed, we call it. Like, what's our minimum speed where we can keep flow and go forward? So, like, I know in a J70, if it's flat water, you can probably get away with somewhere around 2 knots. But that's like when you're starting to flirt with the bottom of, because once you lose flow on the foil rate, you're going to go sideways.
Yeah.
I think along with the ratio to accelerate, it's also really knowing if it's really wavy, that creep speed is going to be lower or whatever. And then it gives you as a driver kind of a feel of like, all right, I've got kind of some parameters of I can't get below this number or, probably going to go sideways. And then your point about starting the boats, I'm a pin guy myself. I like the pin's a little easier to start, but I think the boat comes down, both come down to ley lines. I think really knowing your pin ley line to make sure you're not below it, or your boat ley line to make sure you're not above it. So if we're ever trying to start near the boat, a lot of comms will hear where the closeout is, or if that guy's on closeout. So knowing when you lead back, if the guy to leeward of you could possibly close you out or not. And I think, whoever has the best command of the ley line at the boat usually wins the boat.
So in part 2 of our discussion, I'd love to get into race boat preparation.
Definitely.
Which is, I know it's what you do for a living, and you're one of the top. So I really want to talk about that in part 2.
Definitely.